The battlefield silence was broken only by a child's cry. Caleb Roar's hands shook as he stared at the small body in the tall grass, the boy no older than his own son Samuel. One moment of panic, one trigger pulled in fear, and an innocent life was gone. Now 3 years later, standing on a Wyoming train platform with a crumpled letter in his fist, Caleb thought he'd buried that guilt deep enough. He was wrong. The woman stepping off the eastbound train carried secrets that would unearth everything he'd tried to forget. If you want to know how a mail-order bride arrangement became a deadly game of survival, stay with me till the end. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and facing your darkest truth? Let's see how far this story of redemption travels. Shadows of redemption when a fugitive judge's daughter meets a haunted ex-cavalry rancher. The Wyoming wind cut across the depot platform like a cavalry saber carrying dust and the bitter smell of coal smoke. Caleb Roar stood motionless, his weathered hands gripping a letter from the Rocky Mountain Matrimonial Society until the paper edges bit into his palms. Your intended bride, Miss Clara Whitmore of Philadelphia, arrives on the 2:15 train, June 14th. The words had burned themselves into his memory during the sleepless night that followed their arrival. 4 months ago, whiskey and winter loneliness had made him write to that agency. 4 months of regret had followed, but he'd convinced himself the letter was lost, forgotten, filed away in some dusty office where desperate men's pleas went to die. Yesterday's response had shattered that delusion. The train hissed to a stop, metal wheels grinding against iron rails with a sound that always reminded Caleb of distant artillery. His jaw clenched involuntarily. Even 3 years after mustering out of the 7th Cavalry, certain sounds still transported him back to places he'd sworn to forget. Places where boys died in tall grass while their mothers would never know why. He forced the memory down, focusing on the folded bills in his coat pocket. Enough for her return ticket, enough to compensate her trouble, enough to close this chapter before it opened. The rehearsed words felt hollow in his throat. I apologize, ma'am. I made a mistake. This arrangement won't work. The passenger car door swung open with a metallic groan. A porter stepped down first, then turned to offer assistance. That's when Clara Whitmore appeared. She wasn't what Caleb had expected. Not soft or wide-eyed or desperate. She descended with practiced grace, wearing a charcoal traveling dress that spoke of quality despite the dust of long miles. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that belonged more in a daguerreotype than on this raw frontier platform. High cheekbones, pale skin touched with freckles, and eyes that were an unsettling shade of gray-blue. Eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw with the precision of a surveyor mapping hostile territory. She carried one carpet bag herself and waited while the porter retrieved a small trunk. No excess baggage, Caleb noted. A woman traveling light or traveling fast. What struck him wasn't her youth, though. At maybe 24, she was younger than he'd expected, but the way she surveyed the platform and the town beyond. No fear, no uncertainty, just the calm assessment of someone who'd learned to read danger in shadows and opportunities in chaos. Caleb forced his boots to move, crossing the platform, with the money already warming his palm. The speech he'd practiced crumbled as those gray-blue eyes fixed on him with uncomfortable intensity. Miss Whitmore. He pulled off his hat in a gesture that was pure reflex. Mr. Roar. Her voice carried Eastern refinement that sounded displaced against the raw frontier backdrop, but there was something else beneath it. Something that suggested this woman had seen more of the world's harsh edges than her cultured accent implied. She didn't smile, didn't curtsy, didn't do any of the things he vaguely expected from a mail-order bride. She just waited, and in that waiting, Caleb sensed a coiled tension that matched his own. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how the words he'd rehearsed would sound. Weak, dishonest. Miss Whitmore, I need to be honest with you. I made a mistake writing to the agency. I shouldn't have put you through the trouble of traveling all this way. He held out the money, feeling its inadequate weight. This should cover your return ticket in compensation for the inconvenience. Clara looked at the money in his outstretched hand. Then she looked at him. Then, to his complete bewilderment, she smiled. But it wasn't warmth in that expression. It was something harder. Something with edges sharp enough to cut. No, she said simply. Caleb blinked. Ma'am. No, Mr. Roar. I won't be taking your money, and I won't be leaving on tomorrow's train." The wind gusted between them, catching the hem of her skirt. Somewhere down the platform, a freight handler shouted instructions to his crew. The normal sounds of the depot continued around them, but Caleb felt like he'd stepped into a different conversation entirely, one where the rules had changed and no one had informed him. "I don't think you understand," he said carefully. "I'm offering you a way out of this arrangement. No hard feelings, no obligations." "I understand perfectly." Clara's voice didn't rise, but it cut clean through his protests. "You wrote to an agency in a moment of weakness. You regret it now. You want to erase your mistake with Haitian good intentions. But here's what you don't understand, Mr. Roar. I didn't come here for you." The words landed like a physical blow. Caleb's hand lowered slightly, the bills still clutched between his fingers. "Then why? I came here for a new life." Clara adjusted her grip on the carpet bag, and for the first time he noticed the careful mending along one seam, the worn quality of the fabric. "Philadelphia has nothing left for me. No family, no prospects, and no future that doesn't involve becoming someone's unpaid servant, or worse. When your letter came through the agency, I saw an opportunity. Not romance, Mr. Roar, not rescue, Peto, just a chance at something different." Caleb stared at her, trying to reconcile this blunt honesty with every assumption he'd carried onto this platform. "You're saying you want to marry a stranger for opportunity. I'm saying I want a life that's mine." Something flickered in Clara's eyes, something that might have been desperation if it wasn't so tightly controlled. "Out here I could build that. Back east I can't. So no, I won't take your gilded money and climb back on that train." Before Caleb could formulate a response, a new voice cut through the moment. "Well, well, fresh off the train and already causing a stir." Caleb turned instinctively, shifting to put himself between Clara and the man approaching from the depot office. Vernon Piketown drunk, part-time ranch hand, full-time troublemaker. He swayed slightly as he walked whiskey loose and grinning in the way that made Caleb's jaw tighten. "That's your new mail-order woman, roar. Pike's gaze slid past Caleb to Clara, and the grin widened with predatory interest. "Heard you sent away for one. Didn't believe it. Figured you were too dead inside to bother." "Walk away, Pike." Caleb's voice dropped to a register that had ended more than one confrontation before it started. But Pike was drunk enough to be stupid. He took another step closer, squinting at Clara with exaggerated focus. "She's a pretty thing, I'll give you that. Though if Roar here doesn't want you, sweetheart, I could show you a real good time. Better than some widowman rancher who hasn't smiled in 3 years." Clara's face remained perfectly neutral, but Caleb saw her hand tighten on the carpetbag handle. Before he could move, before he could put himself fully between them, she spoke. "I'd rather walk into a prairie fire," Clara said calmly, "than spend 5 minutes in your company. Now step back before you fall down, because you reek of whiskey and bad decisions, and I've had enough of both to last a lifetime." Pike's grin died. His face flushed red as anger replaced amusement. "You mouthy little—" He reached for Clara's arm. Caleb moved. His hand caught Pike's wrist, mid-grab, twisting it back and down with enough force to make the other man yelp. In the same motion, Caleb stepped close, using his body weight to force Pike back 3 steps until the drunk's shoulders hit the depot wall with a hollow thud. "You don't touch her," Caleb said quietly, his face inches from Pike's. "You don't speak to her. You don't look at her. You understand me." Pike's bravado crumbled fast when faced with someone sober and twice as strong. He nodded, breathing hard, whiskey stink rolling off him in waves. Caleb held him there a moment longer, then released his wrist with enough force that Pike stumbled sideways. "Get out of here." Pike scrambled away, muttering curses under his breath, but not stupid enough to make them loud. He disappeared around the corner of the freight office, and the small crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation slowly dispersed. Caleb turned back to Clara, half expecting to find her shaken or frightened. Instead, she'd set down her carpetbag and was watching him with that same steady assessment. "Thank you," she said. "You shouldn't have had to deal with that." Caleb felt anger still simmering under his skin, not at Clara but at Pike, at this whole impossible situation. This place can be rough. Men like him think they can say or do whatever they want to a woman alone. Then it's fortunate I'm not alone. Clara picked up her bag again, and when she looked at him, this time something had shifted. "Mr. Roar, I'm going to make you a different proposition, than the one you're planning to refuse. Caleb waited still, trying to catch up with how fast this day had spun away from his control. "Hire me as your housekeeper," Clara said. "Pay me a fair wage. I'll cook clean, manage your household. No marriage, no obligations beyond the work. Just employment and a roof over my head. If after a few months we both decide this isn't working, I'll have earned enough to make my own way. Buy a train ticket somewhere else, find other work. But I won't go back east, and I won't take your charity." It was absurd, completely absurd. A single woman living at his ranch, working as his housekeeper, with no chaperone and no formal arrangement beyond employment. The town would talk. Hell, the whole county would talk. But as Caleb looked at Clara Whitmore, at the steel in her spine and the careful hope she was trying to hide, he thought about his ranch. About the cold house waiting in their rooms he hadn't entered in 3 years, because they still smelled like grief. About meals he'd stopped tasting dust. He'd stopped seeing the life he'd been living, like a ghost haunting his own existence. And he thought about Pike's reaching hand, about the way this frontier treated women who had no protection, no place, no power. "The ranch is 8 miles out," he heard himself say. "Nothing but grassland and ska. Nearest neighbor is the Taylor place 4 miles south. It's isolated. I'm not afraid of isolation. Winter gets hard. Snow comes early, stays late. We can go weeks without seeing another soul. I survived 3 Philadelphia winters in a boarding house with no heat. I think I'll manage." Caleb studied her face, looking for cracks in that composed exterior. He found none, just determination and something else. Something that looked like the same desperation he'd felt that February night when he'd written to the agency. Different circumstances, same core truth. Sometimes you reach for anything that might pull you out of the dark. $20 a month, he said, plus room and board. You keep the main house. I'll stay in the foreman's cabin. Clara's eyebrows rose slightly. "You'd move out of your own house?" "Seems appropriate given the arrangement." Caleb picked up her trunk, testing the weight. Not much everything she owned, probably packed into one container. People would talk either way, he realized. Might as well give them less ammunition. For the first time, something that might have been genuine warmth crossed Clara's face. Not quite a smile, but close. "That's considerate." "Don't mistake consideration for approval, Miss Whitmore. This is a temporary arrangement, a trial period." "Understood." Clara fell into step beside him as they crossed the platform toward where his wagon waited. "How temporary are we talking?" 3 months, end of summer. That gives us both time to figure out if this works." "Fair enough." They reached the wagon, a sturdy flatbed that had seen better years but still ran solid. Caleb loaded the trunk into the back, then offered his hand to help Clara up to the bench seat. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second before taking it, her palm cool and calloused against his. Working hands, he noted, not soft, not unused to labor. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clicked his tongue to set the horses moving. The wagon lurched forward, wheels crunching over the rutted street that led out of town. Neither of them spoke for the first mile, the silence filled with the creak of leather and wood, the steady clip of hooves, the endless whisper of wind across open grassland. Finally, Clara broke the quiet. "You lost someone." It wasn't a question. Caleb's hands tightened on the reins, but he didn't look at her. "What makes you say that?" "The way you talk about the house like it's a place you were auditing. And Pike mentioned you hadn't smiled in 3 years. She paused. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." "My wife and son." The words came out flat, factual. Easier that way. "Fever took them both. 3 years ago this October." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then, "My mother died when I was 12. Cholera. My father followed 6 months later, couldn't live with the grief. I understand what it means to survive people you love." Caleb glanced at her, surprised by the offering. Most people, when they learned about Margaret and Samuel, responded with pity or awkward platitudes. Clara just stated her own losses like coordinates on a map. "Here's where I've been, here's what I've walked through." "Is that why you left Philadelphia?" he asked. "Partly." Clara's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon where the mountains rose in distant purple silhouette. "I was living with my father's aunt. She had plans for me. A marriage to a man twice my age who saw me as an investment. When I refused, she made it clear I was no longer welcome in her home." "So you chose the frontier over a society marriage." "I chose freedom over a gilded cage." Clara finally looked at him, and in the afternoon light, her eyes were more gray than blue. Even if freedom means starting over with nothing. Caleb considered this woman who'd crossed half a continent on the strength of a stranger's letter, who'd faced down a drunk without flinching, who spoke about loss like someone who'd learned to carry it without letting it break her spine. "You know anything about running a ranch household?" he asked. "I can cook, clean, mend, and manage accounts. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I learn quickly." It's not just about work. It's about understanding this place, the rhythm of it. Out here, winter prep starts in August. Supply runs happen monthly if the weather holds. Everything depends on water grass and whether the cattle stay healthy. He glanced at her. "It's not Philadelphia." Thank God for that. The corner of Caleb's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. The first time in, he couldn't remember how long. They rode in comfortable silence for another mile before the ranch came into view. His land spread out in all directions, grassland rolling away to meet the sky, broken up by fence lines and scattered cottonwoods marking where water ran. The house sat on a slight rise, 2 stories of weathered wood, with a broad porch and a chimney that needed repointing. The barn stood off to the east, larger than the house, with a corral system that held his current string of horses. Beyond that, cattle dotted the landscape in dark clusters. Caleb watched Clara take it all in, trying to see it through her eyes. The isolation, the emptiness, the raw, unforgiving beauty of a place that gave nothing easily. "It's bigger than I expected," Clara said quietly. 3,000 acres, 200 head of cattle, enough horses to work them. Caleb pointed toward a smaller building near the barn. "That's the foreman's cabin where I'll be staying. Jack Torres runs the day-to-day operations. You'll meet him tomorrow. Good man, keeps to himself mostly." He pulled the wagon up to the main house, set the brake, and climbed down. The porch creaked under his boots, a sound so familiar it had become invisible. How long since he'd really looked at this place? The peeling paint around the windows, the sagging step that needed replacing, the general air of neglect that came from treating a home like just a place to sleep. Clara descended from the wagon without waiting for his help, moving with the same self-sufficient grace she'd shown at the station. She stood looking up at the house, and Caleb wondered what she saw. A fresh start, a mistake, a prison with a different set of bars. "Come on," he said, climbing the porch steps. "I'll show you inside." The front door stuck slightly. It always did when the humidity was high, and Caleb had to put his shoulder into it. It swung open with a groan, revealing the front hallway with its dust-covered table and the stairs leading up to the second floor. He stepped aside to let Clara enter first. She walked in slowly, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood. Caleb followed, seeing the place with fresh eyes and not liking what he saw. Dust everywhere, dishes piled in the kitchen sink visible through the open doorway. The fireplace in the main room cold and full of old ashes. The furniture covered in the fine grit that came in through windows he never quite managed to keep closed properly. It looked like what it was, a place where someone existed but didn't live. Clara set her carpet bag down, carefully turned in a slow circle. "When did you last have a proper meal in here?" Caleb had to think about it. "Can't remember. I mostly eat in the bunkhouse with Jack." "And when did you last open these windows?" "Spring, maybe." Clara walked to the nearest window, fought with the swollen frame for a moment, then managed to shove it open. Fresh air poured in, carrying the smell of grass and distance. She moved to the next window, then the next, opening them systematically, while Caleb stood in the hallway feeling oddly like an intruder in his own home. "You have linens?" Clara asked, already heading for the stairs. "Second door on the left. Should be sheets in the chest." She disappeared upstairs, and Caleb heard her moving around, opening doors, assessing. He walked into the kitchen, really looked at it for the first time in months. The cast iron stove needed blacking. The floor needed scrubbing. The whole room needed someone who gave a damn about whether it was clean or not. When Clara came back downstairs, she'd rolled up her sleeves and pulled her hair back tighter. "I'll need supplies," she said. "Cleaning supplies, food staples. Do you have a list of what's usually stocked? I can write one up." "Good. I'll start with the kitchen tonight and tackle the rest tomorrow." She looked at him directly, all business now. "I'll need access to household funds, or do you prefer to handle all purchases yourself?" Caleb hadn't thought that far ahead. He'd been operating on instinct since the moment she'd refused to leave. "I'll set up an account at the general store. You can buy what you need, within reason." Define within reason. Don't buy anything I can't eat, wear, or use to fix something broken. Clara's mouth quirked upward. That's a low bar, Mr. Roar. It's an honest one. They stood looking at each other across the dusty kitchen, and Caleb felt the strangeness of the moment settle over him. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern had been whether to sell the spring calves early or wait for better prices. Now he had a woman in his house, a sharp-tongued, steel-spined woman, who'd agreed to stay for 3 months and transform his household in exchange for wages and a chance at something better than what she'd left behind. It was insane. It was also somehow already done. "I'll get your trunk," Caleb said, needing to move, needing to do something with his hands. "You take the main bedroom upstairs. It's got the best light." "That's your room." "Was my room, not anymore." He held up a hand before she could argue. "We agreed on the arrangement, Miss Whitmore. I stay in the cabin, you stay here. That's how this works." Clara studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "All right, but I'll help with the trunk." "No need." She was already heading for the door. Caleb followed, muttering under his breath about stubborn women and complicated arrangements. They carried the trunk between them up the stairs, heavier than it looked, clearly packed with everything she owned, and into the main bedroom. Caleb hadn't been in here since the week after the funeral. He'd moved his things out in a cold fury, unable to sleep in the bed where Margaret had died, unable to look at the empty cradle in the corner without feeling like his chest was caving in. Now, standing in the doorway while Clara set down her end of the trunk, he felt the memories rise like floodwater. Margaret's laugh, Samuel's cry, the smell of lavender she'd kept in sachets in the dresser. All of it gone, all of it dust. "Mr. Roar," Clara's voice pulled him back. She was watching him with something that might have been understanding. "I'll let you get settled. Tomorrow Jack and I ride out to check the north fence line," he said, roughly backing toward the door. "We'll be gone most of the day. You'll have the place to yourself." "All right." Caleb paused at the threshold. "There's a rifle above the mantel downstairs. You know how to use one?" "My father taught me. I'm a fair shot." "Of course she was." "Good. Keep it close. We haven't had trouble in a while, but it pays to be prepared." "I will." He should leave, should let her unpack, give them both space to process this strange new arrangement. But something kept him standing there, one hand on the doorframe. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "that thing with Pike at the station, that won't happen here. On my land, you're under my protection. Anyone gives you trouble, you tell me. Understand?" Clara's expression softened slightly. "I appreciate that, Mr. Roar, truly." Caleb nodded, then made himself walk away before the silence got awkward. He went downstairs out the front door across the yard to the foreman's cabin. It was smaller than the main house, just 2 rooms and a fireplace, but it had been kept clean. Jack was particular about things being in order. Inside, Caleb stood in the dimness and let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. What the hell had he just agreed to? A temporary arrangement? A business transaction? 3 months to see if it worked. That's all this was. Clara needed a place to start over. He needed, what? Someone to cook his meals and clean his house. That's what he'd tell himself. That's what he'd tell Jack tomorrow, when the foreman inevitably asked questions. But standing there in the cabin, looking out the window toward the main house where lamplight now glowed in the upstairs bedroom, Caleb knew it was more complicated than that. For 3 years, he'd kept the world at arm's length, worked himself numb, spoke only when necessary, let the house fall into disrepair, because maintaining it felt like an admission that he was still here, still alive when Margaret and Samuel weren't. And then Clara Whitmore had stepped off a train and refused to leave, refused his money, refused his apologies, refused to be dismissed. She'd looked at his grief-hollowed life and seen an opportunity not for romance, she'd made that clear, but for survival, for a chance to build something from nothing. Caleb moved to the window, watched the light in that upstairs room. Clara's silhouette passed across it once, twice, busy with the rhythms of settling in. He didn't know if this would work. Didn't know if 3 months from now they'd shake hands and part ways, or if something else would develop. But for the first time since he'd buried his family, Caleb felt something other than emptiness. Not hope, not quite, but possibility. And in the gathering darkness, with the Wyoming wind singing through the grass and the stars beginning to emerge overhead, possibility felt like enough. But as he prepared for bed, Caleb couldn't shake the feelings that Clara Whitmore was running from something bigger than an unwanted marriage. The way she'd handled Pike, the careful way she'd spoken about her past, the fact that she'd traveled so far with so little, it all suggested a woman with more secrets than she'd shared. What those secrets were and whether they'd follow her to Wyoming remained to be seen. For now, Caleb was content to let her keep them. God knew he had secrets of his own. The nightmare always started the same way. The sound of hoofbeats on hard ground, the metallic taste of fear in his mouth, the weight of a cavalry saber at his hip. Then the tall grass, golden in the afternoon sun, and the sudden crack of rifle fire that sent his horse rearing in panic. Caleb always tried to change what happened next. In the dream, he had time to think, time to aim properly, time to see that the figure in the grass was just a boy hiding from the shooting. But the dream never let him change anything. The pistol bucked in his hand, the small body fell, and he woke with the child's scream still echoing in his ears. He sat up in the narrow cabin bed, sweat cold on his skin despite the summer heat. The nightmare came less frequently now, maybe once a month instead of nightly, but when it did, it left him raw and hollow for days afterward. Through the cabin window, he could see the main house silhouetted against the star-filled sky. No light in the windows now. Clara would be asleep, probably exhausted from travel and the emotional upheaval of the day. Clara. He still couldn't quite believe she was there, that she'd refused his money and insisted on staying. In the few hours since her arrival, she'd already begun transforming his house from a mausoleum into something that felt alive again. The open windows, the purposeful movement, and the simple fact of another person existing in that space, it changed everything. But as Caleb lay back down and tried to return to sleep, he wondered what demons Clara Whitmore carried in her own dreams. Everyone who came to the frontier was running from something. The question was whether the past would be content to stay buried or whether it would follow them both into whatever they were trying to build here. The next morning arrived with the kind of light that made the whole territory glow gold. Caleb woke early, a habit years of ranching had made unbreakable, and dressed in the dim cabin, listening to the sounds of the ranch waking up around him. Horses in the corral, cattle in the distance, the creek running somewhere beyond the cottonwoods. He stepped outside just as Jack Torres emerged from the bunkhouse, already wearing his work clothes and looking as alert as if he'd been up for hours. Jack was in his 50s, lean and weathered, with gray threading through his black hair and eyes that missed nothing. He'd been Caleb's foreman for 5 years, and in all that time, they'd developed a working relationship built on mutual respect and minimal conversation, which made the look Jack gave him, now part curiosity, part concern, all the more noticeable. "Morning," Caleb said. "Morning." Jack walked over, glanced toward the main house where smoke was already rising from the chimney. "You got company." "In a manner of speaking." "Lady arrived yesterday on the train." "That's right." Jack's eyebrows rose slightly. In 5 years, the man had never shown more than mild interest in Caleb's personal life. This apparently qualified as exceptional circumstances. "From back east, Philadelphia." "Philadelphia." Jack repeated the word like he was testing its weight. "Long way to come for what exactly by him?" Caleb felt his jaw tighten. There was no way to explain this that wouldn't sound strange. "I hired a housekeeper. She needed work. I needed someone to manage the household." Simple as that. Jack studied him with those two knowing eyes, and Caleb had the uncomfortable feeling that his foreman saw right through the simplified explanation. But after a moment, Jack just nodded. "Your business," he said simply. "She got a name, Miss Clara Whitmore." "Miss?" Jack's tone was neutral, but Caleb heard the question underneath it. "Miss," Caleb confirmed firmly. "Like I said, it's a business arrangement." "If you say so." Jack turned toward the barn, clearly deciding the subject was closed. "We still riding the north fence line today." "That's the plan." "Good. Wilson spotted some break in the wire yesterday. Might be nothing, might be cattle getting through. Either way needs fixing." They fell into the familiar rhythm of morning work, checking tack, saddling horses, loading tools onto the pack horse they'd bring for repairs. The physical labor settled Caleb's mind, pushed aside the strangeness of the current situation. This was what he knew what he was good at. The ranch didn't care about complicated arrangements or women who refused to follow the expected script. It just demanded attention, consistency, and hard work. He was tightening his saddle girth when movement from the main house caught his eye. Clara emerged onto the porch carrying a basin of water that she poured over the railing into what had once been a flower bed before Caleb had let it go to weeds. She wore a simple dress in dark green with an apron tied over it, and her hair was pulled back in a practical braid. She looked up, saw him watching, and raised one hand in acknowledgement before disappearing back inside. Jack followed Caleb's gaze, then looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. She seems capable. She is. Good. Ranch needs someone to give a damn about the house again. Jack swung up into his saddle with the ease of long practice. Been looking rough for a while now. It was the closest Jack had ever come to commenting on Caleb's grief on the way he'd let things slide. Caleb mounted his own horse, gathered the reins. Yeah, I know. They rode out as the sun cleared the horizon, the pack horse trailing behind on a lead rope. The north fence line ran along the edge of Caleb's property, marking the boundary between his land and open range. It was a constant battle, keeping it maintained. Weather animals and simple time all worked to tear it down. The ride gave Caleb space to think, and his thoughts kept circling back to Clara, to the way she'd stood on that platform and refused to be dismissed, to the steel in her voice when she'd faced down Pike, to the practical efficiency with which she'd moved through his house last night, opening windows and making plans. She wasn't what he'd expected when he drunkenly filled out that matrimonial application. Hell, he didn't know what he'd expected. Someone soft, maybe. Someone looking for a husband to take care of her. Someone who'd fit into the empty spaces of his life without making him look too closely at those spaces. Clara didn't fit. She disrupted. Just her presence in his house this morning, the smoke from the chimney, the light in the windows, the purposeful activity where there had been stillness, it changed things, made him aware of what he'd been living without. They reached the north fence around mid-morning and found the break Wilson had reported. 15 feet of wire down, torn loose from the post with tracks indicating that cattle had indeed pushed through. Jack dismounted and started pulling fresh wire from the pack horse while Caleb examined the damage. Not weather that did this, Jack said, running the wire through his gloved hands. Looks deliberate. Caleb crouched down, studied the torn ends. Jack was right, the wire had been cut, not broken. Someone had wanted his cattle getting through to open range. Rustlers? Caleb asked. Maybe, or someone trying to stir up trouble. Jack began stringing the new wire between posts. You had any run-ins lately? Anyone with a grudge? Caleb thought about it. He kept to himself. Mostly didn't get involved in town politics, paid his debts on time. No one I can think of. Well, someone's thinking of you. Jack secured one end of the wire, started working it tight. Might want to mention it to Sheriff Collins next time you're in town. They worked in silence for the next 2 hours, replacing the damaged section and reinforcing the posts on either side. The sun climbed high and hot, turning the grassland into a shimmer of heat and light. Caleb's shirt stuck to his back with sweat, and his hands ached from the wire work, but the familiar discomfort was grounding. This was real, this was solid. This was something he could fix with his own 2 hands. By the time they finished, it was past noon. They ate a cold lunch in the shade of a cottonwood bread and cheese Jack had brought, washed down with water from their canteens, then mounted up for the ride back. You want me to keep an eye out, Jack asked as they rode, for whoever cut that fence? Wouldn't hurt. Tell Wilson and the others to watch for anything unusual. Riders they don't recognize, cattle moving strange, any more damage. Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon automatically. What about your housekeeper? She know to be careful. I told her to keep the rifle close. She know how to use it. Says she does. Good. Jack was quiet for a moment. She planning to stay after the 3 months? Caleb glanced at him. Why do you ask? Just seems like a lot of trouble to go through for temporary help. Philadelphia to Wyoming, that's not a short trip. Makes a man wonder what she's running from. Everyone's running from something, Caleb said. True enough. Jack let the subject drop, and they rode the rest of the way in companionable silence. They reached the ranch as the afternoon was fading toward evening. The main house looked different, somehow more alive. Laundry hung on the line Caleb hadn't seen used in years. The porch had been swept clean, and through the open windows he could smell something cooking. Actual food, not the beans and bacon he'd been living on, but something with depth and complexity that made his stomach remind him he hadn't eaten a real meal in longer than he cared to remember. Jack noticed it too. Smells good. Yeah. You planning to eat in the house tonight? Caleb hadn't thought about it. The arrangement was supposed to be separate, Clara in the house, him in the cabin, minimal interaction beyond what was necessary for running the household. But the smell of that cooking pulled at something in him, something human, something that remembered what it felt like to come home to a house that was warm and welcoming. I should probably check in, he said, swinging down from his horse. See if she needs anything. Jack's expression suggested he saw right through that excuse, but all he said was, I'll handle the horses. You go on. Caleb crossed the yard, climbed the porch steps, and knocked on his own front door, which felt absurd but also appropriate given the circumstances. After a moment, Clara appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. Mr. Rohr, come in. He stepped inside and stopped, just taking in the changes. The front hall was clean, actually clean, dust-free and polished. The main room beyond had been transformed, floors swept and mopped, furniture dusted and arranged properly, the fireplace cleared of ashes and restocked with kindling, windows that sparkled in the late afternoon light. And from the kitchen, that smell intensified something savory and rich that made his mouth water. I hope you don't mind, Clara said, following his gaze. I took the liberty of organizing things according to what made sense. If you'd prefer a different arrangement. No, it's good. Caleb cleared his throat. It's really good. Clara smiled, a real smile this time, not the careful neutrality she'd worn yesterday. I'm glad you approve. Dinner will be ready in about an hour. I made stew from the beef in your cold cellar and bread from the starter I found in the pantry. The starter still works. Surprisingly, yes, though I had to feed it quite a bit to bring it back to life. Caleb remembered Margaret starting that sourdough culture, remembered her pride when she'd finally gotten it to rise consistently. He'd assumed it was long dead, just another casualty of his neglect. I wasn't sure, Clara hesitated, then continued. I wasn't sure if you'd want to eat here or if you'd prefer I bring something to the cabin. There it was, the question underlying everything. How much distance were they going to maintain? How separate were their lives going to be? Caleb looked around the transformed house, smelled the food, cooking, saw the care Clara had already invested in making this place livable again. And he realized that maintaining complete separation wasn't just impractical, it was unkind. I'll eat here, he said, if that's all right with you. Of course, this is your home, Mr. Rohr. Our arrangement, our rules, he corrected. And if we're going to share meals, you should probably call me Caleb. Clara's smile widened slightly. Then you should call me Clara. All right then, Clara. The name felt strange on his tongue, too personal and too formal all at once. I need to clean up, Caleb said. I'll be back in an hour. He retreated to the cabin, aware that something had shifted. Some line had been crossed, or maybe just redrawn. This wasn't just a business arrangement anymore. Or rather, it was a business arrangement that required more interaction than he'd initially planned. They'd be sharing space, sharing meals, sharing the daily rhythms of life on this ranch. It wouldn't be intimate. It couldn't be. But it would be something. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar to Caleb. He woke before dawn, worked the ranch until his muscles ached, shared meals with Clara that grew longer as they discovered more to talk about, then retreated to the cabin each night, telling himself he was maintaining appropriate boundaries. But the boundaries were getting harder to justify, and he knew it. Clara transformed more than just the house. She brought order to the chaos Caleb had been living in, organized the pantry by category, mended clothes he'd been meaning to fix for months, even started a vegetable garden behind the house using seeds she'd bought in town. She worked from sunup to sundown without complaint, and somehow still found time to read in the evenings sitting on the porch with a book she'd brought from Philadelphia. More than once, Caleb found himself watching her from the cabin window, the way lamplight caught in her hair when she turned pages, the small smile that crossed her face when she read something that pleased her. He told himself it was just observation, just awareness of another person sharing his space. But he was lying to himself, and he knew that too. It was early July when Sheriff Collins organized the first volunteer patrol. Caleb rode out with him on a Wednesday afternoon, both men armed and alert, covering the territory between three ranches that had reported fence cutting. They checked the old Hutchins place Clara had suggested, found it empty, but with signs of recent activity, fresh horse tracks in the dust, cigarette butts that hadn't weathered much. Someone's been here, Collins said, dismounting to examine the tracks more closely. Within the last few days, I'd say. Caleb circled the abandoned homestead, noting the broken corral fence and the trampled grass near what had once been the barn. Good place to hide stolen cattle temporarily. Remote enough that nobody comes out here. We should stake it out, see if they come back. They did exactly that, spending the next 2 nights camped in the hills overlooking the property, taking turns on watch. It was uncomfortable and cold, and ultimately fruitless. Whoever had been using the place didn't return while they were there. But on the third day, riding back to town, they spotted something that made both men pull up short. A group of riders moving cattle across open range, heading east toward the territorial border. Too far away to identify, but moving with the purposeful speed of men who didn't want to be seen. "That's Harrison's cattle," Collins said, squinting into the distance. "I recognize the brand from here. You want to go after them. Not with just 2 of us. They're too far ahead, and we don't know how many there are." Collins swore under his breath. "But at least we know they're moving east. I'll wire the marshal in Cheyenne, see if we can intercept them at the border." By the time Caleb reached the ranch, the sun was setting and exhaustion sat heavy in his bones. He'd been gone 3 days, sleeping rough and eating cold food, and all he wanted was a hot meal in his own bed. But when he crested the rise and saw the ranch spread out below, something made him pull his horse to a stop. Clara stood on the porch, one hand shading her eyes as she looked toward the road, waiting. When she spotted him, she lowered her hand, but didn't move, just watched him approach with an expression he couldn't quite read from this distance. Caleb urged his horse forward, and as he drew closer, he could see the tension in Clara's shoulders, the tightness around her mouth. She'd been worried. The realization hit him with unexpected force. When was the last time someone had worried about him? Really worried, not just out of politeness or obligation, but because they cared whether he came home safe. But their reunion was cut short by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A lone rider came up the drive, well-dressed and moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. Even from a distance, there was something about the man's bearing that set Caleb's teeth on edge. When Clara saw the rider, all the color drained from her face. "Harold," she whispered. Harold Thornton dismounted with practiced ease, his expensive boots hitting the dust with authority. He was handsome in a cold way, maybe 40, with calculating eyes that swept over Clara with possessive familiarity before dismissing Caleb entirely. "Clara," Thornton said, his voice cultured and condescending. "I've come to take you home. This nonsense has gone on long enough." "I am home," Clara said steadily. "And I'm not going anywhere with you, Harold. Don't be dramatic. Your aunt explained everything. You were confused, frightened by the prospect of marriage. But I'm willing to overlook your flight if you come back now." "I wasn't confused. I was escaping. There's a difference, Wacy." Caleb stepped forward, positioning himself between Clara and Thornton. The ladies made her choice clear. "Time for you to leave." Thornton finally looked at him, directly, contempt flickering in his gaze. "And who are you, the rancher she's been keeping house for? Do you really think you can give her what she needs, what she deserves?" "I'm her husband," Caleb said quietly, "as of about 3 hours ago. So yes, I think I can give her what she needs, respect, partnership, and a life she chose for herself." The lie came out smoothly, born of desperation and protective instinct. But as soon as he said it, Caleb realized it didn't feel like a lie. It felt like the truth he wanted, the future he was ready to fight for. The color drained from Thornton's face. "Her husband, that's impossible. She's engaged to me." "Her aunt had no authority to engage me to anyone," Clara cut in. "I'm 24 years old, Harold, a grown woman capable of making my own decisions. And I've decided to marry Caleb Rohr. It's done, legal and binding." Thornton's mask of civility cracked, revealing the anger underneath. "You stupid, foolish girl. Do you have any idea what you've thrown away? My position, my wealth, everything I could have given you. You could have given me a prison," Clara said. "A gilded cage where I'd slowly suffocate under your control. I chose freedom instead. I chose love. I chose Caleb. This isn't over." Thornton's voice dropped to something dangerous. "I have lawyers. I have influence. I'll have this sham marriage annulled." "No, you won't." The voice came from behind them. Sheriff Collins stepped out from the shadow of the barn where he'd apparently been waiting. "Because there's nothing illegal or improper about 2 consenting adults getting married in Wyoming territory," Collins continued. "You, on the other hand, have made threats against Mrs. Rohr. I've got her sworn statement and witnesses. If you don't leave peacefully, right now I'll arrest you for harassment and intimidation." For a long moment, Thornton stood rigid with fury. His hands were clenched into fists. Finally, his survival instincts won out over his pride. "This isn't finished," he said, looking at Clara with cold hatred. "You'll regret this choice, Clara. Mark my words." "The only thing I regret," Clara said, her voice steady as steel, "is ever being polite to you in the first place. Goodbye, Harold. Don't come back." After Thornton rode off and Collins followed to ensure he left town, Caleb and Clara stood on the porch in silence, the adrenaline slowly draining away. "It's really over," Clara said finally. "He's gone." "You were incredible," Caleb said, pulling her into his arms. "The way you faced him down, refused to be intimidated. I'm in awe of you." "I was terrified." "Courage isn't not being scared. It's being scared and doing it anyway." He kissed the top of her head. "You're the bravest person I know, Clara." She looked up at him, her eye bright with unshed tears. "We can't keep pretending this is just business, can we?" "No," Caleb said, "we can't." "Then what do we do?" "We make it real." Caleb's voice was rough with emotion. "We go to town tomorrow and get properly married, if you'll have me." Clara's smile was radiant. "I thought you'd never ask." They made their way to the church the next day, where Reverend Walsh performed a simple ceremony with Jack and Martha Henderson as witnesses. It wasn't the elaborate wedding Clara might have had in Philadelphia, but it was theirs, honest and true and built on a foundation of respect and growing love. The months that followed their marriage brought a rhythm to life that Caleb had never experienced before. With Clara as his true partner, they worked the ranch together, faced challenges as a united front, and slowly built something stronger than either could have managed alone. Clara's vegetable garden flourished and expanded. She started teaching local children whose families couldn't afford school fees. The ranch prospered under their partnership. Clara had a head for business, organizing accounts and negotiating better prices, while Caleb handled the livestock and land management. Winter came hard that year, but the house was warm, well-stocked, and filled with contentment. On long evenings by the fire, they talked and planned and simply enjoyed each other's company. Spring arrived with a rush of green growth and new calves, and Clara announced she was pregnant. The news hit Caleb with a complexity of emotions he hadn't anticipated. Joy and terror in equal measure. The thought of being a father again, of risking his heart on a child who might be taken like Samuel, had been nearly paralyzed him with fear. But Clara, patient and wise, helped him work through it. "We can't live our lives afraid of loss," she said one evening as they sat on the porch. "Yes, something could happen, but choosing not to love, not to hope, that's just another kind of loss." She was right. Caleb chose hope over fear, chose to be present for this pregnancy. He built a cradle from oak wood using skills he'd thought forgotten. Clara sewed tiny clothes, transforming one of the upstairs rooms into a nursery. Their daughter was born on a clear October morning, healthy, loud, and perfect. They named her Rose after Margaret's mother, and as Caleb held his newborn daughter for the first time, he felt the final pieces of his shattered heart slide into place. Not the same configuration as before. The loss of Margaret and Samuel would always be part of him, but whole in a new way, healed enough to hold this new love without fear. As Rose grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to thrive. They faced hard times too. Drought, brutal winters, tight money, but they faced everything together, making even the hardest challenges manageable. On a warm summer evening 5 years after their wedding, Caleb stood on the porch watching Clara play with Rose in the yard. Their daughter was 3 now, running with the fearless energy of a child who'd never known anything but love. Jack emerged from the barn, stopped beside Caleb. "You did good, Caleb." "We did good," Caleb corrected. "Couldn't have managed any of this without you." "I'm not talking about the ranch. I'm talking about choosing to live again, choosing Clara, choosing hope. That took real courage." Caleb thought about the man he'd been 5 years ago, hollow and bitter, going through the motions without really living. Then he thought about Clara stepping off that train, refusing to be sent away, about every choice that had led to this moment. "She saved me," Caleb said quietly. "I was drowning and didn't even know it." "You saved each other. That's what the best partnerships do." Clara looked up, then saw them watching and waved. Rose waved, too, mimicking her mother. Caleb waved back, his chest tight with uncomplicated happiness. That night, after Rose was asleep, Caleb and Clara sat together on the porch as they had countless times before. The stars were bright overhead, and in the distance, a coyote called to the moon. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked, leaning against his shoulder. "How different my life is now. How grateful I am that you were stubborn enough to stay when I tried to send you away." Clara smiled. "Best decision I ever made." "Mine too, writing to that agency, getting drunk enough to mail the letter." Caleb wrapped his arm around her. "I thought I was looking for someone to fill empty spaces. Turns out I was looking for you. We found each other. That's what matters." They sat in comfortable silence, and Caleb thought about the journey that had brought them here. The grief he'd carried for so long hadn't disappeared. Margaret and Samuel would always be part of his story, but it had transformed into something gentler, a bittersweet memory rather than a crippling wound. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For everything. For being brave enough to start over. For refusing to settle for less than you deserved. For choosing me even though I was broken." Clara turned to face him, her eyes serious in the starlight. "You were never broken, Caleb, just hurt. There's a difference. Broken things can't heal. Hurt things can with the right care and enough time." She touched his face gently. "We healed each other." Caleb kissed her, then soft and sweet, a kiss that held 5 years of partnership and love and hard-won happiness. When they broke apart, Clara rested her head on his shoulder again. Inside the house, Rose made a small sound in her sleep. "I should check on her," Clara said. "I'll come with you." They went inside together, climbed the stairs to the nursery, and stood watching their daughter sleep. Rose had Clara's blonde hair, and Caleb's stubborn jaw, the perfect combination of both of them. Tomorrow they'd teach her to ride. Next week, Clara would start planning the schoolhouse they'd finally gotten support to build. Next month, they'd celebrate Jack's 60th birthday. There would be challenges ahead, there always were, but they'd face everything together the way they had from the beginning. Caleb thought about that first day at the train station, about Clara stepping down with her carpet bag and her refusal to be dismissed. About the 3 months he'd said they needed to decide if the arrangement would work. 3 months had turned into 5 years, filled with more life joy and genuine partnership than he'd ever imagined possible. "Come on," Clara whispered, taking his hand. "Let's go to bed." They returned to their room, the room that had once been a place of grief, but was now just their room, filled with their life together. Caleb held Clara close as they drifted towards sleep, and his last thought was simple and true. He'd been given a second chance at life, at love, at happiness, and he wasn't going to waste a single moment of it. In the morning, he'd wake beside his wife, check on their daughter, work the land that had become truly theirs. He'd build and grow and love with the full knowledge that nothing was guaranteed, that loss was always possible, but that the risk was worth it. Because Clara had taught him the most important lesson of all, that surviving wasn't the same as living. That real courage meant choosing hope even when fear seemed safer, that love in all its terrifying vulnerability was always worth the price. And as Wyoming stars wheeled overhead and the ranch settled into the peaceful quiet of deep night, Caleb Rohr finally truly came home.